This is Kol Birama, the podcast of Congregation Ramat Raz 929 Tanakh Project. Join us each day as we study a chapter of Tanakh, building towards completing all 929 together. I'm Rabbi Yoni Zolti, and I'm glad you're here. Bereishit Chapter 41. Chapter 41 chronicles one of Scripture's most dramatic reversals of fortune. Yosef, languishing in Pharaoh's dungeon, is summoned to interpret the monarch's troubling dreams. 7 gaunt cows devouring 7 robust ones, followed by 7 withered stalks consuming 7 healthy ones. His interpretation proves not merely accurate, but strategically brilliant, prompting Pharaoh's astonished response, Hanimsach hazeh ish asher ruach Elohim bo. Can we find another like him, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? Yet, the narrative that follows raises a fundamental question that will reverberate throughout the remainder of Yosef's story. Who is Yosef? Is he Egyptian? Or is he Israelite? As Pharaoh elevates this Hebrew prisoner to become Egypt's viceroy, he simultaneously initiates a comprehensive program of cultural assimilation designed to transform Yosef into an Egyptian. A critical tension lies in examining whether this Egyptianization succeeds, and to what extent Yosef preserves or abandons his covenantal identity. This question carries profound significance from Pharaoh's perspective. He is appointing a foreigner to Egypt's second highest position in a culture marked by intense xenophobia. The narrative later reveals that eating with Hebrews constitutes for Egyptians a toeva, an abomination. Even after achieving supreme power, Yosef will still dine separately from Egyptian officials. Pharaoh himself seems acutely aware of this cultural obstacle. His rhetorical question to his servants, Hanimsach hazeh ish asher ruach Elohim bo, functions less as a genuine inquiry and more as a request for permission, a seeking of consensus from his court. He needs their assent to undertake this extraordinary breach of protocol. The fact that he must publicly justify this appointment, framing it in terms of divine spirit rather than mere competence, underscores the magnitude of the cultural barrier he's attempting to overcome. Some scholars suggest Yosef's elevation must have occurred during the Hyksos period, when foreign Semitic peoples ruled Egypt, since native Egyptian xenophobia would otherwise have precluded such advancement. Whether historically accurate or not, this underscores the extraordinary breach of cultural norms that Pharaoh's decision represents. For this appointment to succeed, Yosef cannot merely exercise administrative authority. He must be transformed, made Egyptian, integrated so thoroughly into Egyptian culture that his foreign origins become irrelevant. Pharaoh's elevation of Yosef unfolds in 3 distinct phases, each marking both a rise in political power and a deepening attempt to reshape his identity. Each of the phases begins identically, Vayomer Paro el Yosef, and Pharaoh said to Yosef. First, even before Yosef's formal appointment, the transformation begins. Upon being summoned from the dungeon, the text notes Vaygalach vaychalef simlotav, and he shaved and changed his garments. This seemingly minor detail carries profound cultural significance. Full body shaving distinguished Egyptians from surrounding peoples, a practice so characteristic that it appears repeatedly in both biblical and archaeological sources. Yosef's physical transformation to conform to Egyptian aesthetic standards represents the first visible marker of his cultural reorientation. His very appearance now proclaims Egyptian identity. The second phase elevates Yosef to imperial viceroy through elaborate ceremonial investiture. And Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand and placed it upon Yosef's hand. He clothed him in garments of fine linen and placed a golden chain upon his neck. He had him ride in the chariot of his second in command. The significance lies not merely in these symbols of authority, the signet ring conferring legislative power, the royal vestment signifying elevated status, the golden chain marking noble rank, but in their intimate, personal nature of their bestowal. Pharaoh himself removes, places, clothes, and elevates. The text emphasizes direct physical contact and personal investment. This intimate transfer of power transforms Pharaoh from mere sovereign into something approaching a father figure, foreshadowing the paternal dynamic that will emerge more explicitly in the narrative's final phase. These external markers, the shaving, the clothing, the regalia, accumulate to create a comprehensive visual transformation. Yosef now appears indistinguishable from native Egyptian nobility. And yet, these physical transformations prove merely preparatory to Paro's more ambitious attempt at identity reconstruction through naming and marriage. In the third phase, Paro addresses Yosef's fundamental identity by renaming him. Vayikra Paro Shem Yosef Safnat Paneach. Naming represents one of biblical thought's most potent exercises of authority. The namer asserts dominion over the named. When, for instance, God renames Avram to Avraham, this signifies Avraham's subordination to divine purpose and redesignation of identity. When likewise Nebuchadnezzar renames Daniel and his companions with Babylonian appellations, he attempts to sever their connection to Judean identity and incorporate them into Babylonian imperial culture. The act of renaming constitutes not merely administrative convenience, but a claim of authority over the very essence of the renamed person. Paro's renaming of Yosef similarly constitutes both a claim of authority and an attempted identity transformation. The name itself remains etymologically complex. Egyptian linguistic analysis suggests possible meanings such as God speaks and lives, or the God says he shall live, potentially referencing either Yosef's miraculous survival from pit to prison to palace, or Egypt's preservation through his administrative foresight during the impending famine. The name thus encodes both Yosef's personal narrative and his new role as Egypt's savior, commemorating the moment when Paro recognized divine spirit within him. The second mechanism Paro uses to fully Egyptify Yosef proves even more comprehensive. Vayiten lo et Asnat bat Potiphera Kohen on, and he gave him Asnat as a wife. This union represents far more than personal partnership or political alliance. It constitutes thorough integration into Egypt's religious and social elite. Potiphera serves as chief priest of On, known in Greek as Heliopolis, Egypt's primary cult center dedicated to Ra, the sun deity. This is not merely any priest, but the high priest of Egypt's most significant religious site, a figure whose authority rivals that of the political establishment. Moreover, Asnat's very name carries religious significance. Derived from the Egyptian goddess Nit, Asnat means she belongs to Nit, marking her as dedicated to Egyptian divinity from birth. Yosef thus marries not merely into Egyptian society, and not merely into the aristocracy, but into the innermost circle of Egypt's sacerdotal elite, wedding the daughter of the nation's most prominent religious functionary, whose very name proclaims devotion to Egyptian deities. The implications are staggering. Marriage creates kinship networks, social obligations, religious expectations. Yosef's children will be grandchildren of Egypt's high priest. His domestic life will be conducted within a household steeped in Egyptian religious practice. His wife's family connections will draw him into the highest echelons of Egyptian religious and political culture. And yet here, the narrative introduces a fascinating literary pattern. Professor Yoni Grossman observed that the sequence of events in this chapter deliberately echoes the foundational covenantal moments of both Avraham and Yaakov. First, there is a sovereign declaration of authority, where Paro declares Ani Paro, similar to the way that God declares to both Yaakov and Avraham, Ani El Shaddai. Second, there is the bestowal of a new name. Third, there is a blessing of fertility, whereas fertility is described using the word pere, and here Yosef at the birth of his son Ephraim describes Kihifrani Elohim, language identical to the promise of Abraham and Yaakov. Then, in all of these situations, there is a specific blessing about the land, and Yosef too as well is told, Vayetze Yosef al Eretz Mitzrayim, Yosef is in charge of the land. There is an accumulation, which is described as Kechol Hayam, like the sand of the seas, and there is a recording of age of how old the biblical hero is in each of these settings. These parallels cannot be coincidental. They are, in fact, the only three passages in all of Bereishit employing this specific constellation of motifs, especially the unique phrase, like the sand of the sea, Kechol Hayam. Only the two foundational covenantal narratives, Abraham in Bereishit Chapter 17, Yaakov in Bereishit Chapter 35, and here Yosef's elevation in Bereishit Chapter 41. This literary structure creates profound theological ambiguity. On the one hand, Yosef's experience occurs in Egypt rather than Canaan, mediated by Pharaoh rather than God directly, resulting in authority over Egypt rather than inheritance of the promised land. These differences suggest discontinuity with the covenant, positioning Yosef outside the patriarchal tradition. On the other hand, the deliberate echoing of covenantal language suggests that despite the Egyptian context, Yosef's experience recapitulates the patriarchal pattern, maintaining covenantal continuity even in foreign soil. Moreover, despite Pharaoh's comprehensive strategy, both physical transformation through grooming and clothing, as well as a nominal transformation and a social transformation, multiple textual indicators suggest that Yosef's fundamental Hebrew identity remains intact. Most tellingly, the narrative consistently employs Yosef's Hebrew name rather than his Egyptian one. Throughout the chapter, and indeed throughout the entire Yosef cycle following this renaming, the text refers to him exclusively as Yosef, and never again as Safnat Paneach. Even when Paro addresses him directly, we read in the text, Vayomer Paro el Yosef. Yosef, not Safnat Paneach. This stands in marked contrast to other biblical name changes. When Avram becomes Avraham, the text transitions to the new name. When Yaakov becomes Israel, both names are used, both Yaakov as well as Israel. Even Daniel, who resists Babylonian cultural assimilation, is consistently referenced as Daniel, whose Babylonian name was Belteshazzar. The text at least acknowledges both identities. With Yosef, however, the Egyptian name appears only in its initial bestowal and never again. This suggests the name's failure to supplant Yosef's original identity, at least in the biblical narrator's perspective. Whatever Egyptians may have ended up calling him, in the covenantal record, he remains Yosef. Moreover, the name itself, whether through Paro's intention or providential irony, resonates with Hebrew phonology even as it carries Egyptian meaning. The word safan evokes the Hebrew word for hidden or treasured, while paneach is often understood as the code or reveal, meaning that Yosef is the revealer of the hidden. This creates a linguistic ambiguity, a name that functions bilingually, maintaining semantic resonance in both Egyptian and Hebrew contexts. The very tool that is meant to transform Yosef's identity inadvertently preserves linguistic connection to his origins. Most revealing, however, are Yosef's choices in naming his sons, which expose the limits of his Egyptianization. His firstborn he names Menashe, Ki nashani Elohim et kol amali et kol beit avi. For God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. Yosef here credits Elohim, employing the Hebrew divine name. Furthermore, the Hebrew construction reveals a grammatical ambiguity. The phrase et kol amali et kol beit avi can be parsed either as all my hardship and all my father's house, or, more likely, as all my hardship and all of the hardship of my father's house, suggesting that Yosef has forgotten specifically the troubles of his father's house rather than the house itself. Still, the name suggests someone attempting to embrace Egyptian life and leave behind painful memories. But his second son receives a markedly different designation. Ephraim, ki hifrani Elohim be'eretz oni, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Again, Yosef here employs the divine name Elohim. The verb hifrani employs the patriarchal root para, directly echoing God's covenantal promises to Abraham and to Yaakov. And yet, most striking is Yosef's characterization of Egypt as Eretz Oni, the land of his affliction. Despite extraordinary success, palatial residence, a marriage into the highest nobility, and supreme political power, Yosef still designates Egypt not as home or blessing, but as a place of suffering. The term Oni carries profound resonance within biblical theology, denoting affliction, oppression, and misery, and will become the defining term for Israel's Egyptian experience. Egypt remains Eretz Oni throughout the Exodus narrative. Yosef's language then anticipates and theologically frames the later national experience of bondage. Both names, Ephraim and Menashe, employ Hebrew roots, invoke the Hebrew God, and reveal that beneath the Egyptian veneer, Yosef maintains theological continuity with his ancestral tradition. Whether he is attempting to forget his family troubles or acknowledging perpetual exile, Yosef never fully adopts Egyptian conventions, never credits Egyptian deities, and ultimately characterizes his Egyptian residence as affliction despite its prosperity. What emerges then is neither complete assimilation nor perfect preservation, but rather a profound ambiguity. Yosef occupies a liminal space between cultures, neither fully Egyptian nor entirely Hebrew. Pharaoh's Egyptianization program succeeds superficially, but fails fundamentally. Yosef may appear Egyptian, shaved, clothed in royal garments, bearing an Egyptian name, married into the priesthood, wielding supreme authority, and yet the text indicates that Yosef's identity is not fully Egyptian. When Yosef's brothers arrive, this unresolved tension will force him to navigate competing loyalties in ways that will reshape his family and redirect covenantal history. Thank you for joining today's learning. See you tomorrow for the next chapter of Tanakh.